disrupted.
America that I fought.
Weird thing to happen. Hello, one and all. Welcome to this edition of Kitz Corner. Hope you're having a fantastic day so far. So, what happens when two White House officials leave and they resign? Well, it turns out they get jobs in media. And that's what Simone Sanders and Jen Psaki, who was the former White House press secretary, have now accomplished too. And now they're going to reminisce about how, and pretty much expose to us, how there's a kind of bondage between the corporate media and the White House officials, and how it's really just a establishment, and how the journalists that are supposed to be holding these people accountable are really in cohorts with each other. And they're going to reminisce about the good old days of how they're incredible partners. As Simone Sanders points out, the majority of the time, we were incredible partners. And here's what they had to say about this in the collaboration between the corporate media and the White House, and how they're basically stenographers for the White House, which is why Jen Psaki and Simone Sanders have lucrative jobs at MSNBC, and people like Julian Assange are locked away in captivity. Take a listen.
What was your best day with the White House Correspondents Association?
You know, I will say the majority of the time they were really incredible partners, because when we were navigating COVID, even though that was some of the hardest times, it was also some of the most collaborative times. I mean, when I was the press secretary, Zeke Miller from the Associated Press at the time was the president. Long may he reign, I used to say, even after he was no longer the president. And we had to navigate through a very difficult time in history, a time where we wanted to return access to the press, show value and respect for the media, but also...
So, this is incredible, because they're just announcing this so casually that there is a collaboration effort between the media, the news journalists, and White House officials. Now, in a proper journalistic setting, you would think that the journalists would have critical thoughts and criticize and hold them accountable. They're not supposed to be partners. They're not supposed to be this collaboration between a press secretary and the press. The press is supposed to hold the White House accountable. But considering the fact that Jen Psaki, who was a former press secretary, is now hosting a show on MSNBC, now you can see that there's an entire collaboration between White House staff officials and the journalists. And that's why the White House Correspondents' Dinner, that's supposed to pat the shoulders of these corporate stenographers and pose them as journalists, is literally just a laughing joke. Because it's patting them on the back for repeating the talking points of your overlords, the White House, and how it's not holding anyone accountable, which is basically killing the idea and the principles of journalism. And that's why you have someone like Jen Psaki and Simone Sanders, who have jobs at MSNBC, and again, Julian Assange is held in captivity.
Do it in a way that was keeping people safe. They're also very important and valuable partners when there are foreign trips. I mean, you know this, when you're going to a war zone, you do go to the Correspondents Association and you say, hey, we're going to go to Afghanistan or Iraq or somewhere that is a challenging security place to be. I need to work with you on how we create.
Now, they bring up war zones. And they talk about how they're, on foreign trips. Now, this is supposed to be a segue into mentioning about Joe Biden and how he made this heroic effort as a president to get on Air Force One at 3 a.m. after there was a train derailment in Ohio and devastations in America. He boarded a plane at 3 a.m. to go over to Kiev in Ukraine. This is supposed to be the segue to say how Joe Biden made a heroic trip. And that's why they're bringing up the fact that, collaboration with, foreign affairs and these foreign trips, and how great we are at, partnering when it comes to foreign response. we're such good collaborators when we're trying to propagandize people, especially at wartime or when we're trying to create a war. We're such good collaborators that way. We work so well to one another. And this is what they're referring to. So when Joe Biden made basically a PR stunt into Ukraine, and this is what the news media was covering. When there was a train derailment in Ohio and America was upside down, they put that all aside to focus on this.
Let's go, guys. Let's go.
Wait, we're gonna wait. We're just gonna give him 1 second. We're just gonna give him 1 second.
We will go.
So that was the apparent heroic stunt that President Joe Biden, that made him so presidential, just like when Donald Trump released those rockets into Syria and Brian Williams literally gushed about it, almost creamed his pants about it. It's so presidential of him to go to a war zone and walk down the path with Zelensky at a time where the air raid sirens were going on, right around the time when the cameras were pointing at him. And the news media gushed about it for so much that the response and the coverage was absolutely hilarious. Because once again, the collaboration between the White House and the news media just proves exactly that it's a propagandized machine to misinform people and manipulate the masses. Because this is what the news media was talking about that heroic trip.
Joe Biden has put solidarity ahead of his own personal safety.
Air raid sirens and no real guarantee of security.
As air raid sirens blared.
This was incredibly dramatic, Andrea. It was historic as well.
Historic, timely, and brave.
The first American president to go to a war zone with no U.S. military presence for security on the ground.
American presidents have made dramatic trips before, Nixon to China, Kennedy, Reagan to the Berlin Wall, and presidents have visited U.S. troops in war zones, but never like this.
To find a day of this kind of presidential bravery in a war zone, you've got to go all the way back to 1864.
With Biden's trip to Europe, he is welcomed as not only frankly the savior of Ukraine, but also the savior of Europe as a whole.
It's historic. It's the first time that
He's a savior. It's like the coming of Christ. We have our savior, ladies and gentlemen. As 80% of Americans don't want him to be reelected. He's the savior of Europe. As everyone's freezing because he blew up the pipeline. But he's a savior. Your Messiah has returned, ladies and gentlemen. Oh. Oh, you can't make this any more hilarious than it already is. And considering the fact that there's a guy from the Washington Post, I don't know his name offhand, but he apparently won an award for the amount of times that he's wrote about how Joe Biden, because of his Catholic background, that's apparently the pedestal, the mindset, the spirituality that he's focused on when it comes to his policies. Like, his Catholic faith is the one that's motivating him, and he wrote an article about it, and he got so much appraisal by this. Oh my God. I like to know what the Pope would bomb. What would Jesus destroy? The savior of Europe. You can't make this any more hilarious. The savior of Europe. Dear God.
the U.S. president has gone into an active war zone that the U.S. military does not have control over.
And against all odds, it was successful.
The continuing threat quite literally sounding all around the two leaders.
The skies here are not safe, and in fact, an air raid siren went off while President Biden was here.
Seeing the American president there, walking the streets of Kyiv.
And again, you think that any person with human eyes and a brain cell would watch the footage and maybe have questions about the fact that an air raid sign magically started as they were walking on camera. You'd think that would be something in the back of your head to think that maybe it was a bit of a stunt, that maybe it was planned, that maybe something came aroused with it. You know, that would take a little bit of thought. That would take a little bit of critical thinking. That would take a little bit of a 2-second, awareness. But then that would ruin the image of this historic event, and it's something that no president has ever done. He is the Messiah. He is the Savior. He is the entire embodiment of humanity, ladies and gentlemen. As the man cannot finish the sentence, talks way too much about ice cream during a mass shooting, and 3/4 of the country that he's the president of doesn't want him to get reelected.
While air raid sirens literally sounded in that moment about possible incoming fire from Russia.
The wail of an air raid siren.
Air raid sirens wailing in the background.
Seemingly undeterred by an air raid siren.
Undeterred by the sound of air sirens.
President Biden's ability with his aviators.
And in their defense, they couldn't find an air raid siren that says, "Let's go, Brandon." They couldn't fine-tune it enough to say that, so it's just a regular air raid siren. On this monumentous historical trip. I love how this is monumentous, but Tulsi Gabbard going to Syria to do diplomacy with Bashir al-Assad is considered an act of terrorism. They called her a toady of Syria. They called her Assad apologist. But Joe Biden is doing this historic efforts. He is the embodiment of a savior.
On to walk through in broad daylight in Kyiv.
The swagger of this trip, not just the execution, the secrecy, but the swagger of it on display on the street.
The swagger. I can't. They use that the swaggerness. Oh my God! An 80-year-old with aviators. It is like a blockbuster moment. Someone should have took a picture and made it into a big giant movie poster. Forget Tom Cruise. We should get Joe Biden to star in Top Gun. That is how much of a monumentous person he is. Strength, encouragement, integrity. Urgh. Oh, this is too hilarious. But here's a little known fact for your consideration, considering that this is kind of kept hush and only ABC News, surprisingly, was the only publication that was willing to address this. But surprise, surprise, the U.S. alerted Russia of Biden's surprise trip to Ukraine hours before he arrived, officials say. Planning for the visit was incredibly desolate and began months ago. So I guess that monumentous, scary, wartime-like situation that, it was such a monumentous occasion was a setup. And it kind of looked like a setup. And now they're confirming it was a setup. The fact that you're going to tell your enemies, hey, by the way, the president of the United States is going to come into Ukraine and walk around with Zelensky. You know, maybe put on the air raid siren so the news media gets a bit of a soundbite. I guess that kind of ruined the image. I'm sorry if that ruins the faith of the mainstream media. I know how much you wanted a president who is a savior by committing acts of war crimes. He is the savior of Europe. Just think of all the people that are, you know, cheering while freezing their asses off in the winter because they blew up the pipeline. The most critical key infrastructure of Europe, they destroyed. But he's the savior. He's definitely the embodiment of all the humanity and good-heartedness of society. He is bringing civilization back to the table, and that's what's so good about this. The collaboration of the news media and the White House officials manipulating everybody. God, it's just so wholesome. It really, really bronzes my heart. It really, 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 really just triggers my COVID symptoms. It inflames my heart 3 times as that day to know that the collaboration of these two is just so impactful on our daily lives. And now you know that the mainstream media is just an arm of the White House, which is just an arm of the intelligence community, which is just an arm of the whole entire corporate-owned and operated establishment. We live in an oligarchy. There is no democracy, and your democracy was bought years ago. And this is all just an illusion. You're ruled by criminal sociopaths that want nothing to do with you and just want to enrich themselves by oppressing you and manipulating you and propagandizing you to hate one another. That is the establishment, ladies and gentlemen, and Jen Psaki and Simone Sanders casually just admit it out loud.